Well, welcome to Christ and Culture. My name is Jeff Short, and today we're going to be talking about a couple of movies that have come out recently. The one is Captain Marvel, and the second one is the Avengers Endgame, and they both deal with some themes that I want to cover today. And the theme is basically the feminist ideology that basically tries to portray women as the warriors, as the soldiers, as the heroes, as the rescuers, as the problem solvers, etc., etc., etc. It plays right into this feminist ideology. For example, in the Captain Marvel, who is a woman, Brie Larson plays the so-called Captain Marvel. Captain Marvel is a woman, and and the plot basically expands around her and her development, and she is the place of, say, like a Superman, only she's a woman, so she's kind of like a superwoman, and it plays right into this feminist ideology, the girl power, girl empowerment. In fact, there are all kinds of institutions now that are lining up behind this idea of girl power, empowering women, empowering girls, as if women didn't have influence, as if girls needed power. I don't quite understand the thinking. There isn't really a strong argument for the case in schools, for example, why girls should be empowered, and or there isn't a clear case that any boy or girl needs to be empowered at a school level. When they're going to school, you're going to high school, and so on and so forth. But the feminists have convinced so many people today that girls and women are oppressed, and they're laboring under this burden, oppressive patriarchy. The patriarchy is in charge, and women are high on the intersectional chart. And so they need to be liberated, they need to be set free, they need to be promoted to positions. For example, in society today, you see this all converging in all kinds of diverse areas. For example, finances. You have the so-called gender pay gap, and you have feminists running around saying, okay, now if you look at the average wage for a man in this executive tier, you will find that it's 15% higher than women at this same level. And this is due to sexism. This is due to discrimination. So we have to address this grave injustice. This is a case where women are being oppressed and discriminated against, and so on and so forth. In other words, the whole narrative is building. Now, different philosophers and different thinkers have addressed that whole issue of the gender pay gap. And no one doubts that there actually is a gap between what a male executive, say, in the auto industry makes from the average female auto executive in the automaker industry makes. And there is a gap there. But to skip ahead, to rush ahead and say, well, that's because of the patriarchy, that's because of male chauvinism, that's because of sexism, and blame and lay blame to bad thinking and oppressive systems and all that, that's a leap, because a lot of the explanations can be simply explained by the fact that when women and men are different, and they make different choices, and they have different goals, they have different aspirations, and many women want the flexibility of being able to leave and having children or taking time off. Men are more willing to put in those long hours and and sacrifice pretty much everything, even, unfortunately, in many cases, their own families, to get ahead, whereas women, even though they may have ambition, are usually not willing to sacrifice their children and their families and their marriage to get ahead. And so you have different abilities, you have different aspirations, you have different things going on in the lives of men as opposed to the lives of women. And so when you factor in all of the different components to the problem of the gender wage gap, you will realize that it isn't because of some phantom patriarchy or this phantom misogyny or all this negative feminist propaganda. It's not that. It's because men and women are different. There are also cries that, there aren't enough women in the STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, and math. There aren't enough women in these fields, and that's because of sexism. That's because of the patriarchy holding women back in these fields. It could simply be that women don't tend to like to go into these fields as much as men tend to like to go into those fields. So you don't have to take the feminist narrative and explain everything on the basis of ill will, ill motivation, evil lurking behind the scenes. No, it can simply be explained by the fact that women and men are different, and they tend to have different interests. For example, in the medical field, most of the jobs that are being filled in hospitals and in medicine are being filled by women. Why? Because they like that field. They tend to want to work in that field. They tend to like to work with other people, and so they gravitate to those jobs. And men, on the other hand, can work alone. They can work without social interaction more. They can work behind a desk. They can work in a lab alone or with just a few people. They don't have to have a lot of interaction, and they tend to work okay in that environment, whereas the average woman would probably not enjoy being alone in a laboratory testing chemicals or whatever. Now, some do, and that's fine. That's why you have some women excelling in the STEM areas, but as far as averages go, no, they don't tend to want to gravitate into those fields as much as men do. And that can be simply explained by the differences between men and women. You don't have to bring in this ideology stuff like patriarchy and sexism and oppression and all this other feminist propaganda. So when we come back to these movies, these Marvel movies, Captain Marvel, for example, from start to finish is feminist propaganda. Start to finish. The Captain Marvel movie tries to be a role model for young girls. In fact, there is a young girl in the movie, and Captain Marvel is a role model for this young girl. And unfortunately, it's an unrealistic role model. If this movie is supposed to be a role model for young girls, then the role model is impossible to obtain, impossible to achieve, and it will ultimately lead to futility and despair, because no young girl can aspire to be Captain Marvel, because Captain Marvel is an impossible person in the real world. You cannot fly around in the sky in the real world. You can't have fire come out of your fingers in the real world, and on and on and on. So it's not a role model for girls. The feminist propaganda would want young girls to believe in that anything is possible for them to be, and that is not true. They cannot or never will be able to just walk into, for example, the military and say, I aspire to be in the special forces, and only sexism and the patriarchy is keeping me out of there. Well, no, it's not that sexism and patriarchy are keeping girls out of the special forces. It's their physical ability. It's their skill set that is keeping them out of special forces, because women cannot run as fast, they cannot lift as much weight, and they cannot endure in the battlefield as well as men. And I don't see any Captain Marvels, feminist soldiers that are acting like Captain Marvel. So to have this movie as a role model for young girls is setting young girls up for failure, because they're going to be marching along thinking, well, I can do it because Captain Marvel can do it. No, Captain Marvel is an imaginary person, and you are a real person. And so if you're a young girl and you want to be like Captain Marvel, you will never be like Captain Marvel. And you shouldn't even aspire to be like Captain Marvel. It doesn't fit with the giftings and the abilities and the interests of even most women. So again, you're really setting young girls up for frustration and anger, and that's probably what's happening in our society today. Feminist ideology has been now a good 3, maybe 4 decades old, teaching women and young girls that the patriarchy, men have been holding them down, and that all their grievances and all of their failures and all of their shortcomings are due to male dominance and unfair systems, and et cetera, et cetera. Well, if you've been fed that all your life and things are going rough for you, yeah, you're going to be angry, and you're going to know who the enemy is, and you're going to lash out at the enemy. So it's really not a very healthy situation for society to be in when you have this kind of ideology, this philosophy, this political persuasion being pumped into the theaters. And that's what Captain Marvel did. All throughout the movie, there are these little, subtle, feminist digs. It's as if you had the founders of the feminist movement joining together and writing a script and saying, okay, we're going to really dig, and we're going to really zing the system at every point we can. Our jokes are going to be all ideological jokes. Our message is that we are not going to take it. We are not going to follow the order of society. We're going to write the rules. We're going to make new rules. We're going to just paint the world the way we want it to be, and we're going to sell that to the audience. And hopefully they buy into that, and hopefully we are able to get across our message to a wider audience through art. A lot of the feminist writings have been in the form of books, and now you have feminist websites online. Not a lot in the arts, but you're beginning to see, for example, more feature-length movies with women superheroes. And in other words, you have movies where the men are waiting around for a woman to come and rescue them from physical danger. And that's what you get in the Captain Marvel movie. Now, I should also bring in the Avengers movie. The same basic plot in the Avengers movie. You have, for example, in the last Avengers movie, you have a scene where the world is in big, big trouble, and then all of a sudden Captain Marvel, Brie Larson, shows up, and she rescues everyone. And then to help her do her job, you have a whole posse of other women superheroes clearing the way for her. So you have this band of women who are rescuing and coming in and saving the day, which is a basic theme in a lot of the movies that are being put out today that are incorporating the feminist ideology and the political leftist ideas. This idea that you don't have to wait for the men to come in. You don't have to wait to for Superman or some action hero or superhero, and don't wait around for Iron Man or whatever. All you need is a superhero woman, and she will come in and save the day. And that's what she does in the Avengers, and that's what she is doing in Captain Marvel, the movie. So you have all these different movies on many different levels, basically communicating the same idea, and that is, this whole idea of women waiting for men to rescue them, that's false. You don't need that. You just need strong women, and that's the whole key. That's the whole ideology that's coming forth from these movies. So let me just read something from an article in Time magazine, and I was reading along in Time magazines, and it struck me. This is an article by Melinda Gates, and it's an interview. And the article is entitled, Melinda Gates explains how she's just like most women. And in one of the questions that she's asked is, you write about your faith as a Catholic, but also that you think the church has helped enhance gender biases. How so? And here's her answer that she gives about her church, which is the Roman Catholic Church. She writes, by not allowing women to be priests and not having women in the top echelons, if our churches are the centers of our community, what are we saying to young girls and boys when they sit in those pews where a female is not allowed to hold a position of the highest authority? So Melinda Gates says that she's a Roman Catholic. I don't know how active in her own church she is. I don't know how faithful she is to the church's teachings. I have no idea about her relationship to her church. All I do know is she's bringing in this girl power, this feminist ideology. She's bringing it to her church, and she's judging her church by her feminist ideology. And she's saying, what is it? What damage is that doing to young girls who sit in the pews where a female is not allowed to hold a position of the highest authority? So her assumption is that is doing damage to young girls because they look up and they don't see any female pope, for example. Or they look up and they don't see any female pastor of the church. And all the leadership in the church is male. And so she's saying that does damage to young girls because that tells them that they're second-class citizens. No, it doesn't. It doesn't tell them that at all. And she needs to really, understand what Christianity is about. She needs to understand what Revelation is about. The Bible, in the New Testament especially because of Christianity, is revelation from God. It says in the Bible that God spoke through the prophets and the apostles. And so when we read the Bible, we're not reading some ancient human text that some men put together concerning religious issues. We are reading the very inspired Word of God. And that's a big difference because if you're reading something that some man wrote because maybe he was inspired to do so, then yeah, you can criticize it, you can critique it, you can say, yeah, that's wrong. He was wrong here, he was right here, he was wrong here, he was right there. As you would say, for example, some philosopher like Plato or Aristotle, or some religious author like, for example, in the 4th century, Augustine. You can read Augustine and say, I think he got it wrong here. When you read the Bible And if you take it seriously, you take it for what it says it is God's Word. So you don't critique the Bible. And the Bible teaches very specifically that God has a specific role for men and a specific role for women in the family and also the church. And so one of the roles of men in the church is that they are supposed to be the primary teachers and the primary leaders in the church. So there cannot be a woman pastor. Now you say, well, wait a minute, there already are women pastors in the Methodist Church, in Lutheran churches, in Presbyterian churches, in the Anglican Church, so on and so forth. There are women pastors. Yes, and that violates the Scripture. That is contradicting the Bible. And Jesus chose 12 apostles. Men, and he did that because he is working in continuity with the Old Testament. The priests were male, and now in the New Testament the disciples are male, and the qualifications for an elder is the husband of one wife, and you have to be a male. There are gifts and callings of God upon men, and part of that calling is to be the primary leader and teachers in the churches. And so Melinda Gates is taking this feminist theology, this ideology, and she is basically imposing it in the church and saying, look, we're politically leftists, we're politically liberal, and we believe in the feminist ideology that was formulated in the 70s, coming out of the 60s sexual revolution. We have embraced that, and so now we expect the church to embrace our political and social philosophies. And the Church of Jesus Christ needs to say back to the feminists, we reject your feminist ideology and political social philosophies. And the reason we do so is because we follow revelation, not philosophy. And so the revelation of God, it is the will of God that men be the primary teachers and primary leaders in the churches. Local churches, national churches, whatever you want to define a church, whether you want to define that as the denomination, whether you want to define that as the local church, whatever you're talking about, God wills for men to be in those positions. He also wills for men to be the primary leader in the family. And he also wants men to be the primary leader in the marriage. Again, these are all things that the feminists are attacking right now. And part of their method for attacking them is to make movies that promote the idea that men are oppressing women when they don't let them, for example, be the pastor of a church. That's what she's saying right here, Melinda Gates. Let me read it again. You write, this is the interviewer, you write about your faith as a Catholic, but also that you think the church has helped enhance gender biases. So she's written, I don't know where, maybe she's written the book, this latest book that she's written, her memoir. She's written that the church has enhanced gender biases. In other words, Christianity is causing trouble, causing problems in society with its insistence that women not be pastors and primary teachers and leaders in the church. And in her view, the Christian church needs to change. Now, we saw this before a couple years ago with Hillary Clinton, who made a speech where she said religion will have to change. She's basically saying we know more than God. We know more than revelation. Our policies, our political policies, have more weight than God's Word, the Bible. And that's basically what Melinda Gates is saying. She answers that question. She says, by not allowing women to be priests, and we might put the word pastor in there as Protestants, by not allowing women to be pastors and not have women in the top echelons. So She believes that the church is hurting women, oppressing women. She believes that the Christian church is sexist because they are clinging to the idea that only men can be pastors and that only men can be the elders in the church, the authority, the highest authorities. And she says that's sexist, that's gender bias, and part of the problem. She says that's part of the problem. If our churches are the centers of our communities, what we are saying to young girls and boys when they sit in those pews where a female is not allowed to hold a position of the highest authority is that they are second-class citizens. So she is putting blame on Christianity for perpetuating gender stereotypes and perpetuating the patriarchy and perpetuating oppression, so-called. And what the confusion is here, and it's the same in these movies that are coming out. And we saw one come out a couple of years ago, last year, Wonder Woman. Again, feminists have called Wonder Woman one of the greatest feminist movie of all time, simply because it showed what they did was basically took a superhero character and made her a woman, and that's it. And so that's supposed to be a great feminist statement that women and girls can be whatever they want to be. They can come in and be the tough guy. They can fight off 10 other guys, no problem. The only thing keeping them down is the patriarchy, sexism, gender bias. The male population is stifling their potential, and so that has to be eliminated. So in other words, we've heard this before, but yeah, the war on young boys, the war on men to be less than what they should be. Now, I'm not talking about men acting badly. You know, if you have brutish, ignorant, stupid, foolish men who are trying to throw their weight around and to not be sensitive to people, if you're talking about families that the male is abusing his power and so on and so forth, no, we're not. No one's defending that. But if you look in the Bible, it tells men how to behave. It tells men how to get along in church, family, marriage, society. And there is an ideal that God has in His Word that men are to be responsible. They're to step up. They're to be brave. They're to be courageous. They're to go out and defend their families, defend their wives, defend their children, defend their country, lay down their life for their loved ones and their family and their friends. And they're to be brave, and they're to be responsible and kind and gentle and everything else. But that's their role. And we don't want, the Bible defines the roles for women, and it's not the same. So we don't want to send women to war and have the men back home taking care of the children. Now, if you have feminist ideology, there would be nothing wrong with that. You would just say, well, yeah, let the women fight. We can do the job, and we can do the job better, they would say. Which is nonsense, which is total nonsense. But that's what Captain Marvel movie tries to portray. That's what the Avengers Endgame tries to show. It just shows men and women, fighting the battle. There are women soldiers, and they fight. And there are men soldiers, and they fight. And men don't have any particular advantage over women soldiers, and women soldiers can keep up with the men in every regard. That's what these movies are trying to portray. That's false. That's total fiction. As we all know, men are stronger pound for pound than women. That's why we want men fighting in the battles. That's why we want women not fighting in the battles. We want them at home taking care of the children. It just is, not only is it biblical revelation, it's common sense. And so I would warn people from allowing these movies and these spokesmen for feminism, like Melinda Gates, to have influence over children, because if you have children believing this feminist ideology, that is going to spell the end of our culture. Well, we'll talk more about this subject next time. Thanks for tuning in. See you back another time.